Dr. Antonio Moreira had always believed in understanding every layer of his hospital, from the top-ranking specialists to the janitors working quietly at night. For years, he had prided himself on running one of the best hospitals in the country, setting the standard for patient care and respect. But recently, rumors had surfaced, subtle yet persistent, suggesting that not all patients and staff were receiving the same level of dignity and attention. Determined to see the situation for himself, Dr. Moreira devised a plan to visit his hospital incognito, dressed in unremarkable, everyday clothing that would help him blend into the background. On a chilly morning, he put on a plain gray sweater, a worn pair of jeans, and comfortable but unassuming shoes. With his hair hidden under a cap and a slight limp affecting his usual confident stride, Dr. Moreira transformed himself into a common visitor, someone who might easily be overlooked or mistaken for a patient from a less privileged background. He knew this disguise would allow him to see what was hidden from his position as chief of the medical staff. As he walked toward the entrance, he couldn't help but feel a mix of anticipation and trepidation. What would he discover about his own hospital today? At the front desk, Dr. Moreira was greeted by a young receptionist whose attention was more on her phone than on him. "Good morning," he said politely, his voice calm. The receptionist barely looked up, mumbling a disinterested greeting before asking him for his information in a tone that felt cold and dismissive. He took a moment to observe her expression, noticing the hint of irritation as she glanced his way. He introduced himself simply as Antonio, withholding his title, and explained that he was there to check on a small, persistent pain he'd been experiencing. "All right, take a seat over there," she said, pointing dismissively toward a row of chairs with one hand while she continued to scroll on her phone. No questions about his symptoms, no reassurance. Just a curt instruction, as if he were an inconvenience to her morning. Sitting down, Dr. Moreira surveyed the waiting area. It was clean but impersonal, with harsh fluorescent lights casting an uninviting glare. He noticed the patients around him, some elderly, others visibly anxious, waiting in silence. A few minutes passed before an orderly walked in, nodding politely at the receptionist, but barely glancing at the waiting patients. The orderly's dismissive manner was subtle yet evident, leaving Dr. Moreira unsettled. As more time went by, Dr. Moreira remained unnoticed, blending into the background. After almost an hour, a nurse finally called his name, her tone devoid of warmth or empathy. She led him down a hallway without any small talk, glancing back only once to ensure he was following her. He felt the stiffness in her posture and the indifference in her movements. When they reached the examination room, she pointed to the examination bed without a word, not even a polite please. Once in the examination room, Dr. Moreira observed how the nurse moved around him, checking his vitals quickly, without making eye contact or asking about his symptoms. He sensed a palpable lack of concern, as though he were simply a number on a list. She spoke to him in a clipped tone, barely giving him the time to explain his discomfort. When he attempted to describe his symptoms, she interrupted him, saying, "The doctor will be here soon. Just wait." With that, she left the room, closing the door a bit too firmly behind her. Alone in the examination room, Dr. Moreira sat in silence, reflecting on the lack of empathy and respect he had encountered so far. He thought of the patients who might have gone through similar treatment, elderly individuals, people from different socioeconomic backgrounds, others like him who just wanted answers and compassion. The experience left a bitter taste in his mouth, filling him with a growing resolve to address these issues. The door opened once more, and a doctor finally entered, glancing briefly at the chart without greeting him. He conducted a quick, perfunctory examination, hardly listening to Dr. Moreira's explanation before suggesting an unnecessary series of tests. As the doctor left, Dr. Moreira felt a profound sense of disappointment. The first stage of his investigation was complete. What he had observed so far was enough to confirm his concerns. But this was only the beginning. With a heavy heart but a determined spirit, Dr. Moreira left the hospital that day, resolved to make changes that would root out the very issues he had witnessed firsthand. Dr. Antonio returned the next day, feeling more prepared to observe the daily routines and the internal atmosphere of his hospital in a way that, until now, he hadn't truly experienced. Dressed simply, he blended in, moving through the hallways without drawing attention. His goal today was not just to see, but to feel, to absorb the subtle cues in people's voices, to notice the moments of kindness or disregard that shaped the patient experience. As he moved through the corridors, he paid close attention to each interaction, observing the routine dynamics that guided the staff, from the doctor's quick greetings to the way nurses and orderlies exchanged glances. His first stop was the waiting room in the emergency department, where he noticed an older man clutching his arm, his face tight with pain and weariness. He looked as if he'd been waiting for some time. An orderly brushed past him with barely a glance, speaking into his phone as he called out instructions to a coworker. As Dr. Antonio watched, a nurse finally approached the man. She gestured for him to follow her with little more than a nod. The man looked relieved yet unsettled, as if he'd hoped for a bit more compassion, just a word or two to make him feel like a person rather than a burden. Dr. Antonio shifted his gaze to the other patients, observing their tired eyes, the anxious fidgeting of a mother holding her young child, the quiet sighs of a middle-aged woman cradling a swollen ankle. Each person had a story, a need, and the patience to sit in silence. As he observed, he noticed that the busier the staff became, the more the patients seemed to disappear. There was no intentional malice, perhaps, but the patients were often met with a kind of indifference that spoke volumes. This wasn't the warmth he'd imagined his hospital providing. He continued moving, feeling his determination grow. Walking down the hall, he stopped near the break area. Staff members huddled in small groups, their voices rising in laughter and chatter. To an outsider, it might seem like a natural camaraderie, but as he listened, he heard undertones that disturbed him. A nurse laughed while sharing a story about a patient she found demanding, her tone betraying a frustration that hinted at disdain. Her friends nodded, laughing, and shared stories of their own. Dr. Antonio knew that patients sometimes required extra time and care, but to hear his own staff speak about them in this way made his stomach turn. Then, he heard another nurse mention the hospital's diversity training, a program he himself had supported. "Honestly, I don't know why we need it," she scoffed, rolling her eyes. "I treat everyone the same. If some people don't feel respected, that's their issue, not mine." Her companions murmured their agreement, some even laughing. Dr. Antonio's hands clenched in his pockets as he realized that what was intended to foster empathy might have simply been dismissed as an inconvenience. The casual dismissal of his efforts to build an inclusive environment revealed just how deeply some attitudes were entrenched. As he moved on, he decided to check the reception area by administration. Here, he saw the rigid formality of hospital protocols in action. An older woman was assisting a young man over the phone, her voice curt as she rattled off a list of documents he'd need to bring to schedule his surgery. "We can't treat everyone who just walks through the door," she said impatiently, then repeated her instructions, her tone increasingly exasperated. For her, he realized the patient was another task to be managed, rather than someone in need of care. This brief exchange struck a chord with him, leaving him with a sense of urgency. Later, at the staff cafeteria, he found himself seated near a group of doctors and senior nurses. They discussed the demands of their work with frustration, but seemed to find humor in how they handled challenging patients. Dr. Antonio listened quietly, trying to gauge whether these conversations reflected deeper issues of care. One of the doctors, a surgeon he recognized from the cardiac unit, mentioned the difficult cases he encountered. Some patients have so many complaints that it makes me wonder if they really need treatment, he said, laughing, and the others chuckled in response. To Antonio, this was a sign of the empathy gap that had grown within the hospital. Returning to his office in the late afternoon, Dr. Antonio sat in silence, reflecting on everything he had seen and heard. The subtle but persistent biases he'd observed, the impatience, and the lack of genuine empathy disturbed him deeply. He was struck by the ways the hospital culture had deviated from the ideals he had hoped to instill. This wasn't a place where patients felt fully seen or respected, and it was clear that the issues ran deeper than he'd initially anticipated. With renewed resolve, he took a long breath, knowing that what he'd witnessed was only the beginning. This mission to bring change wasn't just necessary, it was now deeply personal. He made a promise to himself that he would make the needed changes, even if it meant facing resistance from those who had grown too comfortable with the status quo. Dr. Antonio returned the following day, feeling a renewed sense of purpose. He had spent a restless night reflecting on the indifference and subtle biases he had witnessed among his staff. The feeling that he needed to act quickly weighed heavily on him. Today, he planned to confront some of the staff members who had made dismissive comments, as well as seek insights from those who seemed genuinely compassionate. It was crucial to understand the full spectrum of attitudes within his hospital. As he stepped into the building, he noted the hustle and bustle of the morning shift. Nurses hurried past him, carrying charts and medications, while doctors held discussions over their morning coffee. He took a moment to appreciate the dedication that many of his colleagues displayed, but he also remained acutely aware of the shadows of unkindness lurking beneath their interactions. His first visit was to the surgical ward. He wanted to observe a procedure and, if possible, address some of the surgical staff about the previous day's conversations. Entering the operating room, he was greeted with the sterile smell of antiseptics and the buzzing of equipment. The team was preparing for a routine appendectomy, and Dr. Antonio felt a thrill of nostalgia wash over him. He had performed countless surgeries in this very room. As he observed the team, he noticed the lead surgeon, Dr. Benson, a well-respected figure in the department, discussing the case with the nurses and anesthetists. However, Dr. Benson's tone shifted when he began addressing a new surgical intern, a young black woman named Clara. Make sure you keep your eyes on the field. We don't have time for distractions. We have real patients to save, not projects to babysit. The dismissive comment hung in the air, and Dr. Antonio felt a pang of anger rise within him. Clara's shoulders slumped, and she responded quietly, "Yes, Dr. Benson." The casual disregard in his voice not only undermined her confidence, but also illustrated a broader problem in their workplace culture. After the surgery, Dr. Antonio gathered his courage and approached Dr. Benson. "Can we talk for a moment?" he asked, his tone even but firm. The lead surgeon raised an eyebrow, surprised but nodded, leading Antonio to a quieter corner of the recovery area. "What's this about?" Dr. Benson inquired, crossing his arms defensively. "I couldn't help but notice your interaction with Clara earlier. Your words had a significant impact on her," Dr. Antonio replied. "We should be fostering an environment of support, especially for our interns. They're the future of our field." Dr. Benson scoffed. "It's a tough world out there, Antonio. She'll learn quickly or won't make it. That's just reality." "No, it's not just reality," Dr. Antonio countered, feeling his frustration boil over. "What you did was disrespectful. We need to hold ourselves to a higher standard, especially as leaders. We must ensure that everyone, regardless of their background, feels valued and supported in this environment." The conversation hung in the air, thick with tension. Dr. Benson stared at him, clearly taken aback. "I'll think about it," he said finally, dismissively turning away. Feeling unsettled, Dr. Antonio left the surgical ward, his heart heavy. He realized that changing the culture would not be easy. Entrenched behaviors were difficult to shift, but he refused to give up. He had a vision of the hospital becoming a beacon of respect and inclusion, and he was determined to make it happen. Later, he visited the outpatient clinic, where he interacted with several nurses and administrative staff. He wanted to gauge their perspectives on patient care and how they perceive their responsibilities. To his surprise, he found a few nurses who expressed genuine concern about the issues he had witnessed. They spoke candidly about their frustrations with the system and how they often felt overwhelmed by the bureaucracy, leaving little time for compassionate care. "I love helping people, but sometimes it feels like we're just numbers on a chart," one nurse, Lisa, said, her voice laced with emotion. "It's hard to connect with patients when you're rushing from one task to another." Dr. Antonio listened intently, grateful for the honesty. "That's exactly the point," he said. "We need to change how we approach our work. We need to prioritize meaningful interactions with our patients." As the day wore on, Dr. Antonio continued to speak with various staff members, gathering insights and opinions on how to improve the hospital's culture. The more conversations he had, the clearer it became to him that while some staff were genuinely compassionate, others remained entrenched in their biases and views. Returning to his office, he began drafting a plan for a series of workshops and training sessions aimed at fostering empathy, respect, and teamwork among the staff. He envisioned creating a more inclusive environment where every voice mattered and where patients would feel genuinely cared for. That evening, he sent an email to the hospital administration outlining his proposal for the workshops. He emphasized the importance of creating a culture of respect and inclusivity, providing tangible examples of how this change could lead to better patient outcomes. With a sense of determination settling in his chest, Dr. Antonio knew he had taken the first step toward transformation. He would fight for the change he believed in, even if it meant facing resistance from those unwilling to adapt. This was not just a professional responsibility for him. It was a deeply personal mission. The following week, Dr. Antonio was filled with a mix of anticipation and anxiety as he prepared for the first workshop on empathy and inclusivity. He had worked tirelessly on the curriculum, ensuring that it addressed not only the importance of compassion in healthcare, but also the impact of biases and systemic inequalities. He had invited several respected speakers from diverse backgrounds to share their insights and experiences, hoping to create an engaging and enlightening environment for his colleagues. As the day approached, however, he sensed an undercurrent of resistance among some staff members. Whispers echoed in the break room, filled with skepticism about the workshops. "Another sensitivity training? It's just going to be a waste of time," one nurse remarked dismissively as she poured herself a cup of coffee. Dr. Antonio was determined to break through this negativity. On the morning of the workshop, he arrived early to set up the conference room. He arranged chairs in a semicircle, ensuring everyone would be encouraged to participate. He decorated the walls with posters that read phrases like "compassion is key" and "everyone matters," hoping these visuals would set a positive tone. As his colleagues began to arrive, he greeted each one with a warm smile, but he couldn't help but notice the reluctance on their faces. Some entered with their arms crossed. Others rolled their eyes at the banners he had put up. He felt a wave of doubt wash over him. Was he naive to believe that a simple workshop could change deeply rooted attitudes? When the workshop began, Dr. Antonio opened the floor by sharing his vision for a more inclusive hospital. He spoke passionately about how empathy could improve patient care and the importance of recognizing the biases that might cloud their judgment. "We have the power to change lives, but it starts with how we view each other," he urged. However, midway through the presentation, he was met with hostility. A senior nurse, Maria, stood up, her face flushed with indignation. "With all due respect, Dr. Antonio, we've been doing our jobs just fine. I don't see why we need this training. We're not racists. We just work hard to keep this hospital running." The room fell silent, and Dr. Antonio felt a pang of disappointment. That's exactly it, Maria. It's not about labeling anyone as a racist. It's about recognizing the subtle ways bias can creep into our interactions, often without us even realizing it, he explained, trying to maintain his composure. "Then maybe you should look at yourself, Doctor," Maria shot back, her voice sharp. "You're the one trying to make us feel guilty for doing our jobs." Dr. Antonio took a deep breath, feeling the tension rise. He realized that addressing these concerns head-on was necessary, but he needed to approach it with care. "I appreciate your honesty, Maria. My intention isn't to make anyone feel guilty, but to foster understanding and compassion. It's a process we can all benefit from." The discussion shifted, and soon other voices began to chime in. Some staff members expressed their frustrations about the overwhelming demands placed on them, arguing that they were too busy to engage in workshops. Others voiced concerns about how these sessions might be a waste of time. Yet several nurses spoke up in favor of Dr. Antonio's vision, sharing their own experiences of feeling overlooked or dismissed in the past. "I've seen patients treated poorly because of their background," one nurse shared, her voice shaking. "It shouldn't be like this, but it is. We need to talk about it." Dr. Antonio seized the moment. "Exactly. This workshop is a chance for us to learn and grow together. We all have blind spots, and that's okay. What matters is our willingness to acknowledge them and strive for better." As the workshop continued, he noticed a gradual shift in the room's energy. People who had initially been skeptical began to engage, asking questions and sharing their thoughts. He introduced small group discussions, encouraging attendees to reflect on their own experiences and biases. By the end of the session, the atmosphere had transformed from one of resistance to one of curiosity and openness. As attendees began to leave, Dr. Antonio felt a sense of accomplishment. He had faced challenges, but the dialogue had been constructive. Many staff members approached him afterward, expressing their appreciation for the workshop. They acknowledged the need for ongoing conversations about inclusivity and empathy in their work environment. However, he also sensed that not everyone had been convinced. Some left the room with their arms still crossed, their expressions unyielding. The path forward would be long, and he knew that change wouldn't happen overnight. Later that evening, he reflected on the day's events. While he felt hopeful, he also understood the complexities of the situation. Change would require continuous effort and a willingness to confront uncomfortable truths. He was ready for the challenge, determined to make his hospital a place where every patient and staff member felt valued and respected. The aftermath of the workshop stirred a mixture of hope and anxiety in Dr. Antonio. In the following weeks, he noticed subtle changes within the hospital. Some colleagues began to engage more openly, sharing their experiences and thoughts during staff meetings. Conversations that once felt tense and reserved now flowed more freely, punctuated by laughter and a sense of camaraderie. One afternoon, as he walked through the bustling corridors, he overheard two nurses discussing a patient's treatment plan. Their conversation turned to the challenges faced by patients from marginalized communities. "I never realized how different their experiences could be," one nurse admitted. "It really opened my eyes. We need to be more proactive in understanding their needs." Dr. Antonio felt a swell of pride. The seeds of empathy he had planted were beginning to take root. However, he also understood that these changes were fragile, and he needed to nurture this growing awareness. Inspired by the positive response, he decided to introduce a series of follow-up workshops, focusing on specific issues such as cultural competence and addressing biases in healthcare. As he prepared for the next workshop, he invited staff members to share topics they found important. To his surprise, many came forward with ideas that reflected their own experiences and concerns. It was a pivotal moment. He was no longer the sole driver of this initiative. The staff were beginning to take ownership of their learning journey. During the next session, Dr. Antonio was thrilled to see a full room. The atmosphere buzzed with energy and anticipation. He opened the floor for discussions, encouraging participants to share their stories and perspectives. This time, the resistance he had felt previously had diminished significantly. Colleagues exchanged anecdotes about patients whose backgrounds had shaped their healthcare experiences, creating a shared understanding that fostered unity among the staff. One poignant moment came when an older doctor, Dr. Fernandez, shared his story. He spoke about a patient he had treated years ago, a young immigrant who had been reluctant to seek care due to language barriers and fear of discrimination. I didn't understand the full extent of what he was facing until I took the time to listen, Dr. Fernandez reflected. It's easy to overlook the struggles of others when we don't take the time to understand their realities. The room fell silent, each person absorbing the weight of his words. Dr. Antonio felt a surge of gratitude for the openness that had blossomed within the group. He facilitated discussions that allowed everyone to voice their thoughts, and he could see the positive impact on his colleagues. They were learning from each other, broadening their perspectives, and embracing the concept of compassion in healthcare. As the weeks passed, the workshops continued to attract participants. Dr. Antonio also initiated small group discussions focused on case studies that highlighted the intersection of race, culture, and health. This hands-on approach encouraged staff members to apply what they were learning to real-life scenarios. However, not everyone was on board with the changes. A few staff members, including Maria, still harbored doubts. They viewed the workshops as a distraction from their primary duties and criticized the shift in focus. One day, during a staff meeting, Maria raised her concerns again. I get that we need to be compassionate, but this feels like it's taking time away from patient care. We can't forget what our main job is. Dr. Antonio listened carefully, understanding her frustration. I appreciate your perspective, Maria. But consider this. By fostering a more inclusive environment, we can actually improve patient care. When we understand our patients' backgrounds and needs, we're better equipped to provide effective treatment. Maria sighed, unconvinced. Maybe, but it still feels like we're being forced to change without a clear reason why. Sensing the tension in the room, Dr. Antonio decided to invite an external expert to speak about the tangible benefits of cultural competence in healthcare. He hoped this would provide a fresh perspective and help alleviate some of the concerns. On the day of the expert's visit, Dr. Antonio introduced her to the staff with great enthusiasm. Dr. Wilson was a renowned cultural competence advocate, and her expertise could shed light on the practical implications of empathy in their work. She shared compelling statistics showing how inclusive practices had led to improved patient outcomes, emphasizing that understanding cultural differences could save lives. Her presentation resonated with many, sparking a lively discussion. Colleagues began to share their own ideas on how they could implement changes in their daily interactions with patients. It was a breakthrough moment for Dr. Antonio. He could see the shift in mindset taking shape. After the workshop, several staff members approached him, expressing renewed enthusiasm for the initiatives. I think we're starting to see the bigger picture, one nurse admitted. This isn't just about being nice. It's about making a real difference in our patients' lives. Dr. Antonio felt a wave of relief. He knew that the journey ahead would be challenging, but this was the kind of progress he had envisioned. With the support of his colleagues, he was more determined than ever to create a healthcare environment where every patient felt valued and respected. Yet, as he reflected on the changes taking place, he was acutely aware of the complexities that lay ahead. He needed to ensure that this momentum didn't fizzle out. His commitment to fostering a culture of empathy and inclusivity was unwavering. and he was ready to face any obstacles that might arise. As the months rolled by, Dr. Antonio continued to build on the momentum from the workshops. Staff engagement was on the rise, but challenges lingered beneath the surface. Some colleagues still held on to their biases, unwilling to fully embrace the cultural shift he sought to create. One such colleague was Dr. Mendez, a well-respected surgeon with decades of experience. Although he was skilled, his dismissive attitude towards patients of different backgrounds often left them feeling alienated. One afternoon, Dr. Antonio overheard Dr. Mendez speaking dismissively about a recent case involving a Hispanic patient. "These people don't understand our system," Dr. Mendez scoffed. "They expect everything to be handed to them, but they don't even know how to fill out basic paperwork." The words stung, and Dr. Antonio felt a surge of frustration rise within him. Determined to address the issue, he approached Dr. Mendez later that day. "Can we talk for a moment?" Dr. Antonio asked, trying to keep his tone even. Dr. Mendez looked up, surprised but curious. "Sure. What's on your mind?" Dr. Antonio took a deep breath, aware that this conversation could be pivotal. "I overheard your comments earlier. I want to emphasize how crucial it is for us to remain empathetic towards our patients, regardless of their backgrounds. Many come from different cultures and may not understand our system, but that doesn't make them any less deserving of our care." Dr. Mendez raised an eyebrow, a hint of defensiveness creeping into his expression. "I understand that, but you can't expect them to come here and act like they know everything. They need to take some responsibility, but we're in a position to guide them," Dr. Antonio countered. "Instead of dismissing them, we can help them navigate our system. That's what compassionate care is about." Dr. Mendez paused, considering the younger doctor's words. After a moment, he shook his head. "Look, I get that you want to promote this empathy thing, but sometimes it feels like we're coddling people instead of holding them accountable." Dr. Antonio felt a pang of disappointment, but refused to give up. It's not about coddling, it's about understanding where they're coming from. If we want to improve patient outcomes, we have to create an environment where everyone feels valued. That starts with us. The conversation ended without resolution, but Dr. Antonio felt a sense of accomplishment simply for having spoken up. Later that week, he decided to host an informal gathering for the staff to further discuss the importance of empathy and accountability in patient care. The event was designed to be relaxed, an after-work meetup with snacks and an open forum for discussion. Dr. Antonio hoped it would encourage his colleagues to voice their opinions in a less formal setting. As the evening approached, he was filled with a mix of excitement and anxiety. Would his colleagues engage, or would they remain closed off? To his relief, several staff members attended, and the atmosphere quickly turned friendly. They shared laughs and stories, creating a bond that extended beyond their work lives. As the conversation shifted towards patient care, Dr. Antonio seized the moment. "I want to emphasize the role of empathy in our interactions with patients," he began, looking around the room. "It's essential that we create a welcoming environment, especially for those who may feel marginalized." "How can we do this better?" Nurse Alicia spoke up. "I think we need to make more effort to learn about our patients' backgrounds. Sometimes I feel like we assume too much about them without really knowing their stories." "That's a great point," Dr. Antonio replied. "Understanding their cultural context can make a huge difference in how we approach their care." As the discussion progressed, several other staff members shared similar sentiments, emphasizing the importance of active listening and tailored care. Dr. Mendez, who had initially been skeptical, surprised everyone by chiming in with a story from his own experience. "I once treated a patient who was resistant to treatment because he had a cultural aversion to certain medications. It wasn't until I took the time to understand his perspective that I could find a solution that worked for him." Dr. Antonio smiled, encouraged by the shift in tone. "That's exactly what we're talking about. Each patient is unique, and our job is to understand their individual needs. By the end of the evening, the atmosphere felt lighter. Colleagues were laughing and engaging in conversations they might not have had otherwise. Dr. Antonio knew this was a step in the right direction, but he also understood that the journey was far from over. The next day, Dr. Antonio received an unexpected email from Dr. Mendez. "Can we meet?" It read simply. Intrigued, Dr. Antonio agreed to a lunch meeting. As they sat down at a nearby cafe, he wondered what had prompted this request. "I've been thinking a lot about our last conversation," Dr. Mendez started, his tone more reflective than usual. "I didn't realize how much my comments might have impacted our patients and the team." Dr. Antonio felt a flicker of hope. "I appreciate your willingness to discuss this. It's not easy to reflect on our biases. I've been considering the workshop series you've been organizing," Dr. Mendez continued. "I'd like to contribute. I think I can share some insights from my years of experience. Maybe we can bridge the gap between empathy and accountability." Dr. Antonio nodded, surprised and pleased. "That would be fantastic, Dr. Mendez. Your perspective could be incredibly valuable." As they finished their meal, Dr. Antonio felt a renewed sense of optimism. The change he envisioned for the hospital was beginning to take shape, one conversation at a time. He understood that change would not happen overnight, but with allies like Dr. Mendez joining the cause, he felt more empowered than ever. The months flew by, and the impact of Dr. Antonio's initiatives began to resonate throughout the hospital. The workshops became a regular fixture on the calendar, attracting an increasing number of staff members eager to engage in meaningful discussions about empathy and cultural competence. Dr. Mendez, now fully on board, often led sessions alongside Dr. Antonio, sharing his wealth of experience while promoting a new understanding of patient care. The ripple effects of their efforts were evident. Patient feedback showed marked improvements, with many expressing gratitude for the compassion and understanding they received during their visits. The hospital's reputation began to shift. It was no longer just a place for medical treatment, but a community focused on healing and inclusivity. However, challenges still loomed large. During a particularly busy week, Dr. Antonio received word of a severe incident involving a patient and staff member. A young Black woman named Jasmine had come in for a routine checkup, but had experienced distressing behavior from a nurse who treated her with suspicion and condescension. Dr. Antonio was determined to get to the bottom of the matter. He arranged a meeting with Jasmine to discuss her experience. Sitting in a quiet room, he watched as she nervously fidgeted with her hands, the anxiety evident on her face. "Jasmine, I want you to know that you're safe here. Your feelings and experiences matter, and I'm here to listen," he said gently. Jasmine took a deep breath and began recounting her experience. "I just went in for a checkup, but the nurse seemed to think I didn't belong there. She kept asking me questions about my insurance and if I could pay for my treatment. I felt so embarrassed and humiliated." Dr. Antonio listened intently, nodding as she spoke. "That's unacceptable, Jasmine. You deserve to be treated with respect, just like any other patient here. Thank you for sharing this with me." After their conversation, Dr. Antonio knew he had to act. He scheduled a meeting with the nursing staff to discuss cultural competency and the significance of treating all patients with respect. This meeting was particularly crucial, as it would not only address Jasmine's experience, but also emphasize the hospital's commitment to inclusivity. As he prepared for the meeting, Dr. Antonio felt a mix of anxiety and determination. He was aware that some staff might resist the message, but he also knew that this was essential for fostering a supportive environment. During the meeting, Dr. Antonio opened by sharing Jasmine's story, emphasizing the emotional impact that such encounters could have on patients. "Every patient walks through our doors with their own stories and struggles," he said. "It's our responsibility to ensure that they feel valued and respected." The room was filled with murmurs, and some nurses shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Dr. Mendez, sensing the tension, spoke up. We need to remember that our biases can affect our patients' experiences. I've seen it happen before, and it's not right. We can't afford to let our preconceived notions dictate how we treat others. Dr. Antonio nodded in agreement. It's crucial that we recognize our biases and actively work to overcome them. Our patients are looking to us for care and understanding, and it's our job to provide that without judgment. Slowly, the atmosphere in the room began to shift. Nurses started to engage in the conversation, sharing their own experiences and acknowledging their challenges in treating patients from diverse backgrounds. I've had patients who spoke little English, and I struggled to communicate with them, one nurse admitted. I didn't realize how important it was to find ways to connect with them. That's a great point, Dr. Antonio replied. Finding common ground is essential. It's not just about the medical care. It's about the whole experience. We can provide resources and support to help with language barriers. As the meeting continued, ideas flowed and strategies emerged. They discussed implementing better communication resources, such as translation services and cultural sensitivity training. The commitment to change felt palpable, and Dr. Antonio's heart swelled with hope. By the end of the meeting, several nurses expressed a desire to create a peer support group focused on addressing cultural competency within their ranks. The energy in the room had shifted from defensiveness to collaboration, and Dr. Antonio felt a sense of accomplishment wash over him. In the weeks that followed, Jasmine's story became a catalyst for change. The hospital began to actively promote cultural competence, hosting more workshops and inviting speakers from various backgrounds to share their experiences. Staff members embraced the opportunity to learn and grow, understanding that they were part of a larger mission to transform the patient experience. Dr. Antonio found himself reflecting on the journey he had taken. It had started with a desire to foster empathy and understanding, but it had blossomed into a movement within the hospital. The staff was beginning to see the value of diversity not just in the patients they served, but also within their own ranks. As he walked through the hospital one day, he noticed the new posters adorning the walls. Messages of inclusivity and compassion that reinforced the hospital's commitment to its community. Each poster was a reminder of the work they had done and the work still to come. One afternoon, Dr. Antonio received an email from the hospital administration. They wanted to recognize the progress made over the past few months and were planning a special event to celebrate the staff's commitment to cultural competence. Dr. Antonio couldn't help but smile. It was a testament to their hard work and dedication. On the day of the event, the auditorium was filled with staff members, all eager to celebrate the changes they had implemented. Dr. Antonio took the stage, heart racing with excitement. Today is a celebration of our journey together, he began. We've faced challenges, but we've also seen remarkable growth. I want to thank each and every one of you for your commitment to creating a more inclusive environment for our patients. As he spoke, he noticed Dr. Mendez in the crowd, nodding along with pride. The transformation had not just been about changing policies. It had been about changing hearts and minds. They were on the cusp of something truly transformative. With each passing day, Dr. Antonio knew that they were not just changing the way they cared for patients. They were changing the very fabric of their community. Together, they were building a legacy of compassion, understanding, and hope. Dr. Antonio stood at the threshold of his office, gazing out at the bustling hospital. The air was electric with a sense of purpose. He could feel the momentum of the changes they had implemented in recent months. The journey they had undertaken had been long and arduous, but the fruits of their labor were becoming increasingly evident. As the weeks passed, the cultural competence initiative flourished. Staff members embraced the new training programs, and patient feedback reflected a noticeable improvement in their experiences. Jasmine's story, once a catalyst for change, had become a cornerstone of the hospital's mission. One day, while reviewing patient surveys, Dr. Antonio stumbled upon a letter that caught his eye. It was from Jasmine, expressing her gratitude for the care she received during her stay. In her letter, she detailed how the staff's sensitivity and understanding had made a profound impact on her healing process. "You treated me not just as a patient, but as a human being," she wrote. "You showed me that I matter." Moved, Dr. Antonio shared the letter with his colleagues during their monthly meeting. The room fell silent as they listened to Jasmine's words. It was a poignant reminder of why they had embarked on this journey. After the meeting, Dr. Mendez approached Dr. Antonio, her eyes glistening with pride. "We've truly made a difference," she said, her voice filled with emotion. "This is what we set out to do." "Yes, we did," Dr. Antonio replied, a smile spreading across his face. "And we can continue to build on this foundation. Our work isn't done yet." Inspired, they began to brainstorm ways to further enhance their efforts. They decided to implement community outreach programs aimed at educating families about health resources available to them. The idea was to empower the community and ensure that they had the tools necessary to advocate for their own health. As they launched these programs, Dr. Antonio noticed an increase in community participation. Families began attending workshops and health fairs, eager to learn and engage. It was a heartening sight, a testament to the power of trust and understanding. Months turned into a year, and as they approached the anniversary of the Cultural Competence Initiative, Dr. Antonio felt a sense of pride swell within him. The hospital was now recognized as a leader in diversity and inclusivity, receiving accolades from various organizations for their groundbreaking work. To celebrate their progress, the hospital organized a community event, inviting patients, families, and staff. It was a day filled with activities, workshops, and guest speakers who shared their stories of resilience and hope. Dr. Antonio felt a profound connection to the community as he interacted with families who were grateful for the care they had received. As the sun began to set, Dr. Antonio stood on the stage, looking out at the crowd. "Tonight, we celebrate not just our achievements, but the strength of our community. Each of you plays a vital role in this journey, and together, we can continue to create a space where everyone feels valued and respected." The crowd erupted in applause, and Dr. Antonio felt a surge of energy course through him. This was more than just a hospital. It was a sanctuary of healing and understanding. He realized that their work was not only about medical care. It was about fostering relationships built on trust, empathy, and love. After the event, as people mingled and shared stories, Dr. Antonio noticed Jasmine in the crowd. She approached him, her face radiant with joy. "Dr. Antonio, thank you for everything. You've changed my life and the lives of so many others." Dr. Antonio smiled warmly. "It was a team effort, Jasmine. Your courage to share your story sparked a movement. You are a part of this legacy." Jasmine's eyes sparkled with hope. "I want to give back. I want to help others like me." Inspired by her words, Dr. Antonio invited her to join the outreach team. Together, they could empower others, ensuring that every voice was heard and every story mattered. Jasmine eagerly accepted, and together, they began to shape a new chapter in their hospital's history. As Dr. Antonio walked home that evening, he reflected on the journey they had embarked upon. It was a journey of growth, understanding, and transformation, a legacy that would resonate for generations to come. He felt a profound sense of gratitude for the people who had supported him, the patients who had inspired him, and the community that had embraced him. He understood that the fight against prejudice and discrimination was ongoing, but they had made significant strides. With every heart they touched and every life they changed, They were building a brighter future, one filled with compassion, hope, and understanding.